and communications consultant.
19 #1 best-selling.
You have been nominated and won so many awards throughout your careers.
She has a wealth of experience interviewing and consulting with well-renowned figures, celebrities, and corporations. Nadia speaks on how to get people to like you, trust you, and want to do business with you.
Over the last few weeks, the entire world has been monitoring the treatment of your grandfather, Nelson Mandela. And my job was to introduce it and provide.
With topics like leveraging the power of your personal presence, networking for success, and lighting the fire. Nadia Bilchik.
What a pleasure to be here, and what a pleasure to be joined by Eduardo Briceno, and I hope I said that correctly.
Beautifully. Thank you, Nadia. It's great to be here.
So I have a question for our audience today, and that is, how much time do you spend learning new things and perfecting your craft, or are you so busy performing? So Eduardo, I thought about this for our conversation today is, yes, I'm performing, but I'm also learning from you. And you have one of the most popular TEDx talks, and you talk about the difference between constantly performing and the value of learning as well. It is called How to Get Better at the Things You Care About, Performing versus Learning. So tell us about that.
Sure. Great to be here, Nadia. I was a long time ago, 13 years ago, introduced to Carol Dweck. She's a Stanford professor, and she coined the term growth mindset, which is the belief that you can get better. And in helping organizations lead a culture of learning, a culture of continuous improvement and innovation, and how to apply a growth mindset, I noticed that a lot of us have a vague idea that the way to get better is just to work hard. If we just work hard at getting the work done, then we'll get better. But actually, if you look at the research and if you get the greatest performers, they are clear that the way to get better is not just to work hard at execution. Improvement takes a different type of effort. It takes trying new things, which means that we're not going to do them perfectly. We're going to make mistakes, and we can learn from those mistakes. It takes soliciting feedback. It takes not only saying that mistakes are okay, but actually examining mistakes and talking about those mistakes, what we can learn from those mistakes, how we can do things differently next time. It takes, after we have client meetings, talking about what went well, what we could change differently. So it takes behaviors that are different than just trying to get the work done as best as we can. And when we are stuck in chronic performance, in just the idea of today I just have to do things as best as I can and minimize mistakes, then that leads to stagnation. And the way to increase performance over time, so it's not like we're either choosing between learning or performing, but if we want to increase performance over the long term, then we have to also engage in learning behaviors and not just in performance behaviors.
And you give such a great example in your talk. You talk about Beyonce.
Yeah, Beyonce is a great role model. She literally is a performer. So she puts together these incredible performances where they do their best work. They try to minimize mistakes. If they make a mistake, they try to cover it up, right? That's what when you're on stage, that's what you do. But then afterwards, she actually, every time she watches a video of the performance, she looks at what could be improved. She makes a lot of notes for everybody in their team, and the next morning, everybody receives notes on what to change differently. They practice, and then that evening in the next performance, they try something different. And those things that they do outside of the stage, looking at the video, reflecting and sharing ideas and practicing, those things are learning zone activities, which allow them to increase their performance.
And Eduardo, you're writing a book at the moment. Tell us more about this project.
Yeah, so the book is about the two zones, the learning zone and the performance zone. And it is also, it goes into a lot deeper than the TED Talk does. The TED Talk is a 10-minute introduction to the difference between these two zones. But in the book, eventually we first get clear about what the learning zone and the performance zone are. But then by the end of the book, we're also thinking about how we can do these two things at the same time, because we all have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of things to get done. We have little time. And it turns out that the way that we perform can be either by not noticing the ways we can improve, or we can notice what we can improve and try things differently as we perform. And so how can we have two goals at the same time of learning and improving, and how can we execute at those? So that's something that we will explore. Something else is that when we are performing, we can do that for different reasons. Like, for example, sometimes we perform to prove ourselves, to prove our ability to other people. Sometimes we perform in a competitive sense in terms of being better than other people. And sometimes we perform to have an impact, to have a purpose that is going to make contribute something to other people. And those motivations have different ramifications. Like, for example, when we are concerned about proving ourselves to other people, that can be an okay source of motivation while we are performing highly and while we're doing things well. But when we struggle, or we make mistakes, or we experience failure, then we are a lot more brittle. We're less resilient because we take our struggle as evidence that our ability is low. We don't want to feel incompetent. We don't want to have other people see us as incompetent. So we tend to give up. We say, I'm not good at this, so I'm going to go do something else. And so thinking about, when are we performing for different reasons? How do we want to go about performance? How do we want to go about learning? And how do we get better at both of these things? Because both of them are important. The other thing that happens, and that we'll also explore in the book, is that sometimes we get stuck at performing something that is almost like inertia, or just the momentum of the mundane or the daily life. And we forget, because it's harder, or we don't identify the things that are more important, that are less quantifiable, they're less salient. And so how can we become clear at the things that are most important, and how can we get better at those things, is something that's also something to think about.
And that's so well put. Stephen Covey always spoke about the importance of sharpening the saw. Famous analogy, he's got two woodcutters. The one is being very laborious. The one gets his work finished. The one who's taking a long, long time says he doesn't have time to sharpen his saw. But just taking that moment of reflection and looking at the how and stepping aside. And I was particularly interested in your work because for those of us who are in the world of professional development and coaching others, and also getting coached. I mean, Eduardo, you are a global speaker. I still run things by a mentor, having a group of people, even if you are already an established professional. I mean, you and I met in a mastermind class. And most of those people in the mastermind class are professionals who are doing very well, who are seasoned. You're probably one of the younger ones amongst us. And yet there's still that desire to say, what else can I learn to get better? So it brings us to this period of life that we're in right now, which is people are having to rapidly adapt and learn. So when you go into an organization or you speak to a company about how do I as a leader help people understand that feedback, as my friend Beatrice Rodriguez says, she's from Home Depot, she was head of diversity and inclusion and doing all kinds of wonderful things there. But she always says, how do you help people understand that feedback is a gift?
Mm-hmm. Great. So there's a lot to that, and it's so the first thing is we usually start working with the most senior leaders of an organization because they are the role models. They're setting what's important for the organization. They're the ones communicating what's important and serving as the models of how people want to behave. Mm-hmm. And what we encourage leaders to do is first work within ourselves as an individual. So, as you said, for example, feedback as an example, what is my relationship with feedback? When am I soliciting feedback on a regular basis as a leader? Mm-hmm. When I get feedback, what's my reaction to that? What is the sense that I make of this information that I'm receiving, or do I see it as an attack or as an indication that I'm not capable or ready to be a leader? So first, doing some internal work in terms of what is my what I call the mental coherence for growth. If we want to get better, if we want organizations to get better.
For growth. I like
mental coherence for growth. So for example, sometimes we like the idea of our organizations driving continuous improvement and innovation, but we don't realize that we see feedback as a source of weakness. Yes. that's an
and
incoherence.
the defensiveness when you get feedback.
Right. And so that's an incoherence, right? Or we might see mistakes as something that we want to try to minimize, and we want to be flawless all the time. If we reason through that, there's incoherence in that. So we need to examine where we have cognitive dissonance or incoherence, and what is our relationship to change and unpredictability and feedback and failure. And how can we get more coherent within ourselves in order to, so another thing to consider on that is mindset. If there's a lot of research that shows that if we see people as fixed the way they are, then we don't focus on improvement, right? We don't focus on changing ourselves, which is necessary in order for improvement to take place. So thinking about what abilities and qualities do we see as fixed in people, whether in ourselves or in others? How is that affecting our behaviors? And how is that driving or inhibiting, continuous improvement and innovation? So doing that reflective work, that internal work is where to start. But then once you've gone through some of that work, something that you can do as leader, like just 3 things to consider that you can do as a leader.
Can I take a pause before you give us those 3 things? And I want anybody who's watching or who's in a position to take out a pen and paper to do it. If you're driving, please don't. I want those 3 things. And if you have just joined us, something, by the way, Eduardo, that I've learned from Clubhouse is they keep resetting the room. And that is, if anybody is just joining us now, I'm talking to Eduardo Briceno, and he speaks about growth mindset. His TED Talk, I have already posted. You will want to watch it. So how to get better, things you care about, performing versus learning. So Eduardo, now take a moment. So I hope you've got your pens because you want to write down 3 things that you can do. Yes.
Yes. So once you've done some internal reflection work as a leader, and it's work that never ends. I mean, we need to. So individually, something that I find to be really helpful is to have a STEM habit, which is a stable habit that enables us to continue to change over time. Something that I do on a daily basis every morning is I look at what it is that I'm working to improve in myself or to change in myself. So I do that every day, and that enables me to continue to change and improve over time. So the individual work never ends, but three actions that we can take as a leader of an organization are: first, think about how we frame things to ourselves and to others. Second, think about what systems and habits we're putting in place for performance, but also for improvement. And third is model learning for other people. So to unpack that a little bit, in terms of framing, we need to think about how do we make sense of what it is that we do on a daily basis? Is part of what we do on a daily basis when we go to work, growing ourselves and continuing to develop ourselves, no matter how good we are, getting better, developing more insight, learning from other people, trying new strategies. Just like Olympic gold medalists, they're the best in the world, but they wake up the next day trying to get even better. So the fact that we're working to get better doesn't mean that we are not good. Like, the best people continue to get better over time. And so how do we frame things using ideas like growth mindset, like performance zone, like learning zone? When we are doing an activity, like, for example, we're going to go meet with a client, is that a performance zone activity? Is that a learning zone activity? Are we going to try to do both things there? And aligning, because in some client meetings, we're just going to want to try to put our best foot forward, minimize mistakes, and just try to get the deal. And in other client meetings, we might experiment with something we haven't tried before. But if we haven't aligned on what it is that we're doing in that meeting, then we're going to step over each other. We're going to do things that are going to make each other upset. So framing what it is that we do on a daily basis. Second, systems and habits, particularly. So how do you want people to learn and improve in your organization? Is it through experimentation? If so, are there systems for people to experiment and to measure the results of those experiments and to share those results with other people? Is it by what we talk about on a daily basis in our weekly meeting? If so, does the agenda reflect that? Is there a learning-oriented part of the meeting where we are either asking each other questions or talking about what we're learning or what we're struggling with? Is it by doing kind of smart experiments that, crazy, like times and spaces with low stakes, where we can try wild things that may or may not work.
Can you give us an example? Like,
Yeah.
Anybody who's listening, watching, joining us, because I think what you're saying is so important. We get so stuck in the whirlwind, we forget to be strategic. We begin, go back to the idea of being deliberate. And so is there something you could think of that somebody could do right now?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of examples. So, for example, Facebook does over 10,000 experiments a day on their website, where they do A/B experiments and they see what works and they keep iterating from there. There's a company called Sprout Pharmaceuticals that it was acquired, but before that, they had the ritual that over lunch, they would talk about what other companies do and what they could learn from those companies. So that leads anybody in the team to be listening to podcasts, or when they go out to the dry cleaners or a restaurant, they notice what they're doing to get ideas. They share those things over lunch with their colleagues. There was a team in Oracle where everybody in the team every quarter does what they call the smart experiment, whatever they want to experiment with. And then once a quarter, they have a 5-minute presentation to the rest of the team about what they did and what they learned and how they assessed.
Eduardo, build it in. Make it as part of the curriculum, of the work schedule as anything else.
Absolutely. Yeah. So like a way to build it in conversations, for example, that I love is the agenda. Like if we are using the same agenda for a weekly meeting or a monthly meeting, if you want to talk about certain learning oriented things, you change the agenda template and that changes the conversation. There's, at Bridgewater Associates, they record every meeting, and that recording is available for everybody to listen to and to learn from and to give feedback. Other organizations encourage the soliciting of feedback all the time. So it depends on what your context is and how you want people to improve, but being clear about how do you want people to improve, and are you setting up those systems and habits in place? And that ties to the third strategy, which is modeling learning. Often when we get promoted and we get to leadership positions, often we feel that now we need to know and to have the answers. Mm-hmm. And so that is incoherent, because what happens is that we might talk about learning and the importance of feedback and mistakes and all that, but we see ourselves as knowers and we see other people as learning. And the problem is that our actions speak louder than our words. And if people see the leader in the organization as somebody who is a know-it-all rather than someone who's a work in progress and continuing to get better, they're going to say, okay, what I need to do eventually is become a know-it-all. Maybe I'm there already, and then I can get a promotion. And so people emulate the behaviors that they see, and so as leaders, really not, and often leaders also are great learners, but they do it behind curtains. So we might do it in our office or in our commute back home or at home, and people don't see us doing our learning behaviors. And so it's important not just to do them, but also to make them visible. As
you're saying this, there are two things. First of all, we have a very good comment from LinkedIn, and I'm going to read it to you. Our wonderful colleague, friend, and part of our mastermind, James Kerr, says, we sometimes forget what's important. Taking a moment to reflect on this is essential part of resilience. Oh, then he says, good stuff, Nadia and Eduardo. Thank you, James. But Eduardo, as you said this, I remember working at CNN once, and Jeff Zucker is the CEO, having something happened, and it was a few years ago. I can't remember the exact detail, but he didn't necessarily make a perfect call. And I was so impressed that in the next day he said, yes, I didn't make the perfect call. I should have done X. And it was a moment of thank you. Thank you for telling us you are human. And as you say, in terms of modeling, that gives you permission. So the question to ask yourself, whatever level of an organization you're at, is, are you modeling it? And that's so important. And then the other thing, Eduardo, that I'm so intrigued by is just the brain. I do a lot of workshops and seminars on how to give and receive feedback. And we know that if you are not skilled at giving feedback, the recipient goes into fight, flight, or freeze. Equally, if you are not skilled at receiving feedback, what is the one thing we know you should say if you get the feedback? I always say to people, just go,
thank you.
Yes. And it is hard to do, Eduardo, especially when it's from your own children. That's thank you. Now, of course, you say tone. There's a difference between someone gives me feedback and I go, thank you, or I go, thank you. But learning thank you as a recipient, even if you don't feel it, is something so important. And then obviously teaching people. So it's a two-way thing, isn't it? Giving and receiving. So when you come onto an interview like this, Eduardo, do you perceive this as performing because you're in your zone? You're having to speak about what you know, or do you see it as a learning moment?
So I see it as an intersection of the two. And I'll talk more about that. But first, I want to comment on the feedback part and the thank you part. I completely agree with you. And I think it ties to me about one of the 4 strategies that you talked about in your TEDx talk, which was wonderful. And it's about kind of genuine curiosity. As an interviewer, you're genuinely curious in asking questions to the other person. And I think that thank you eventually, ideally, comes from a genuine place of, I'm really curious about what you have to share with me. Is information that's in your mind that I don't know, and I can't know unless you share it with me. So, whether, it's not about right now, as I receive it, it's not about whether I agree with it or not. It's always useful information. So thank you for sharing that with me.
And it takes training. It takes training.
Automatically,
I don't like it if somebody says something that, what I'm saying is it's counterintuitive. And part of what we teach in the world of professional development is to be counterintuitive. I always say, it's counterintuitive for me to be looking into my camera right now and not at Eduardo. But after 30 years behind a camera, it is a trained skill. And in the same way, we train people to have a moment of consciousness, to say, thank you.
Yeah.
And maybe go against the basic thing, which is a mental shutdown.
Yes. And so I completely agree. And just a comment on James' comment on resilience and the reflection part. One of the things that the reflection allows us to do is to identify what's most important, the higher level goals. And we want to be most resilient on those higher level goals and least resilient on the lower level goals, because sometimes we need to change strategies to pursue the same most important higher level goal. And so when we think about resilience, reflecting to get clear on what's most important and figuring out how can I get better at that sometimes involves giving up at the strategies, the how, so that we can try a different how. But to answer your question about the performance zone here, I definitely want to do a good job, right? This is your show. I want this to be of value to the people who are watching. So I want to do a good job. I want to do things that I know work and that I know have been helpful to other people. And at the same time, I want to seek feedback or seek information or seek things that I don't know while we're talking. So for example, when you talked about this Stephen Covey quote about sharpening the saw, that's not a quote that I was familiar with. And so I'm going to make note of that later because I want to commit that to my memory so that I can recall it, when it's relevant, just like you did when we talked. Or after this talk, I'm going to ask you for feedback because you are the person that I don't know anybody who is more knowledgeable about interviews than you are. So I would treasure your feedback after we talk. So I do want to do a good job, but I also want to take opportunities to learn from it. And those are we can have both of those goals at the same time, but we need to be conscious that improving involves things that are different than just performing. And so being clear about how we're doing each of those two things is something that's very helpful.
But just the way you've articulated it is so powerful. So for people who are joining us, to look at yourself right now and say, are you in performance? Are you constantly learning? And I think one has to be very discerning about the learning. So for example, Clubhouse, which is this new app for Apple users, which is a community of people, voice only, where you can meet, chat. Why are you going onto Clubhouse? So I was talking to one of the people who came onto a chat that I had. Are you going there to learn, to maybe pick up a nugget from a speaker who you would otherwise not hear? Are you going to network, or are you going to sell? So for me, if I can pick up one thing, somebody the other day said, don't demand followers. You can't say to people, follow me, follow me, follow me. And he said it so beautifully, Mark Angelos. He said, Following is like friendship. It is earned. And now you, Eduardo, might have said that in another way, but I thought, oh, that's another nice one to add to my arsenal because I'm teaching networking, I'm teaching virtual presence. Maybe somebody else says it in a way because there's nothing novel that any of us say. There's no brand new concept, but there's Eduardo's story. It's what you bring to growth mindset. So when you look at yourself and how you've evolved, what would you say has been your biggest growth areas?
The biggest, well, there's a lot of growth areas. I first of all grew up as an extreme introvert, and I got really, really nervous speaking one-on-one in private with anybody. So now speaking in public with you right now, that I've had to do a lot of growth to be able to do that and to be able to enjoy it. This is a really enjoyable conversation for me. And so that's involved a lot of change in my identity and how I view myself. But probably the biggest change for me was when I realized the importance of purpose, of realizing that I need to be doing something that is contributing to other people's lives right now, and not living the deferred life plan of the idea of like, I'm going to work really hard and then I'm going to have the things that I need in order to enjoy. I need to be doing work that I find important and fulfilling right now. I think that pursuit of purpose and of making an impact changed the way that I approach life and work, and then got me on a trajectory that have led to lots of delightful fruits and an experience of life that is really, really precious. So I'm very thankful for that insight.
And how did you meet Carol Dweck, and how did the partnership begin?
Yeah, so before I met her, I spent some years working in investment banking, Wall Street, and in venture capital in Menlo Park in Silicon Valley. And it was great learning, but on retrospect, I didn't feel a sense of purpose because I was so young and inexperienced, and I was sitting on boards and supposedly advising these CEOs, and I didn't have any experience. So I felt inauthentic. I felt like I was just repeating what other people around the board table were saying, and I didn't understand why that was wise advice. And that was creating a lot of stress. And I thought that these great investments were going to happen with or without me. And so I went through a health crisis and all kinds of, quarter life crisis. And I ended up taking care of my health, but also realizing that I needed to search for purpose. And my wife had been switching through several jobs until she became a teacher. And I saw a change in herself that I hadn't seen in any of the job changes, where she found her purpose. And I said, wow, that's awesome. I want that for myself. So I went to grad school to interest in social. What's that?
You went to Stanford.
I went to Stanford, where Carol Dweck was a professor. I was interested in social entrepreneurship and education. I was pursuing several social venture ideas. And toward the end of my 2 years there, one of my classmates was at a reception and met one of Carol's friends. And Carol's friend told my classmate, hey, I know this professor who's doing really cool work, and she's looking for somebody to partner with a business background to bring her work into the world. And so the two of them connected us, and Carol and I started meeting every 2 weeks. And I really loved her work. Her book, Mindset, shed a lot of light and insight for me around my life and the decisions I had made and the ways that I had limited myself through my fixed mindset beliefs. So I said, wow, this is really can change a lot of people's lives and contribute to a lot of people's lives. And so we partnered up 13 years ago, and that's how I met her.
It's an extraordinary story, but also, 13 years, the concept of mindset is now so mainstream and everybody's speaking about it. And Brene Brown recently interviewed an author who has done new research on the brain. And it was an understanding that as we got older, we had less neuroplasticity to create new neural pathways, to change, to shift. And in fact, he dispels that myth. He says, except for language, and he gives an example, if you have not learned language by a certain age, it's not a language. Some language you can acquire new language. But he tells a horrible story about a kid who was locked up in a cupboard who never learned language. It's very hard after a certain age to acquire the skill of language. But Other than that, the brain, the adult brain, has far more neuroplasticity than ever imagined. So it's so perfectly aligned with your work around, yes, we can shift mindset.
Absolutely, and there is research on people at an older age who learn to think differently about their abilities and themselves as people who can change and improve. Then there's a lot more learning behaviors and a lot more learning and improvement. But one thing that happens when we age, I think, is that we start having explanations for kind of hiccups in the brain that are tied to age that we used to experience when we were young. Like sometimes, right now, I can't remember certain things. And then I talk to my parents or my in-laws, and the same thing happens to them. They say it's because I am older now. And when that happens, I think we tend to kind of say, okay, my brain is deteriorating, and this is something that I can't affect, versus, in order to keep my brain sharp, I need to continue learning new things and trying new things and exploring, and that leads to different behavior, and it leads us to continue to be sharp throughout time.
Eduardo Briceno, I love that we've been speaking about mental coherence for growth. And the question that you need to ask yourself right now is, are you creating fertile ground for personal growth? I have posted Eduardo's TED Talk, so it is there to see. He goes into more detail. And Eduardo, as soon as the book is out, I look forward to talking to you again. As we end today, this is the end of a week, a difficult week in terms of news and new COVID strains and all kinds of things. My wish for everyone is that you stay safe and stay sane. And, I always go back to the serenity prayer, which is, God, grant me the strength to control the things I can, and just what can you control right now? And certainly your mind and learning new things is one of them. Your last thoughts of the day.
Well said, Nadia. Just building on what you just said, for me, learning is a source of happiness and fulfillment, and it is one that nobody can take away from me. Related to what you just said, I might lose my health, I might lose my loved ones, I might be put in a concentration camp, but nobody can take away my ability to learn new things, and that gives me confidence that I can lead a fulfilling life.
Eduardo Briceno.